Well, this was a large overtaking. I had the idea to go back and look at the video games based on one of the biggest websites for kids in the 2000s, Neopets. This particular video will be split up into multiple parts before adding them all together into one larger video akin to my Sonic 06 video. That's just to make it a bit more digestible, and so people who want to see my thoughts and opinions on a specific game or part of the website will only have to look for that specific video. That being said, I'm gonna have to go into a bit of history on the site first for anyone who is not up to speed on their Neopia lore. And yes, it's Neopia. That's the world that Neopets takes place in. Neopets itself celebrated its 25th anniversary last year, and while I haven't entirely been on the site since the beginning, over the years I have definitely come back to it, mostly for nostalgic reasons. Though some of my favorite games are no longer on the site, what with the destruction of Flash. I remember making multiple accounts because I was a dumb kid and would forget about the site and all my login info for a while. I've since made a new account in the past year and have been slowly falling down the entire Neopets rabbit hole. Oh yes, Neopets is still a thing. Last year they celebrated their 25th anniversary and held multiple events. But that's not the focus of this large project. The focus is on the fact that over the quarter century that the site has been available, there have been a few video games that have been based on the franchise. And the first game ever that was released based on the series was the Darkest Faerie. Unless you want to get into semantics and talk about flip phone mobile games, but for sake of argument, the first major game is the Darkest Faerie. That being said, I'm going to go into the history of the site quickly in order to provide context. After that, I do want to talk a bit about the development history as well. It is a bit interesting. If you just want to skip to the game itself, skip to the time on screen or follow the chapters I will try and include. Or if you're watching this individual video and don't want to hear about the history or development, just skip to another video. For everyone else, let's get into it. First things first, I know that Neopets was a huge thing back in the 2000s, but it hasn't really been able to be as big as it was back in its heyday. I want to say its peak was around 2005 when this video game first came out, especially when the brand had two separate promotions with McDonald's and eventually one with Burger King, before the company was eventually sold to Viacom and advertisements were shown on Nickelodeon. Starting back in 1999, the site was once considered one of the biggest sites for kids. Gameplay-wise, Neopets is very similar to a Tamagotchi, or heck, even a Digimon. However, unlike Tamagotchi, it does have many extra bells and whistles, like the Battle Dome, which is an arena where you can have your Neopets fight other Neopets or characters from along the site. It's done in a pseudo-Pokemon style, though you can equip your Neopet with different weapons and gear to make them stronger or their attacks more effective. Plus, there are the site's mini games that feature characters made to expand on the site's lore or to tie in with a larger plot that was going on at the time. And yes, the site has grand and extensive lore. Not entirely surprising because the site has been going for over 25 years. I'm not at all surprised when people think that the site shut down years ago, though part of that is because with Flash being a major component of the site in its earlier days, and Adobe Flash no longer really being a thing outside of emulation, it does make it a bit challenging for the site to still be as big as it once was. And yeah, the site isn't really as grand as it was back in its heyday with the removal of Adobe Flash, but it still has a bit of charm. And while not every game works, most of the big ones are still around. Something that did surprise me when looking into the multiple games that have been released over the franchise is the fact that they are considered canon to the larger story of the site, or even multiple plots that have happened since the game's releases. A few of the games even link to the site and give you special rewards if you were to enter codes that you get by playing the game. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, these codes no longer work. But I am happy to see Torment or Roberta, the characters from Darkest Faerie, get referenced. In fact, in the most recent plotline, The Void Within, they had both Roberta and Torment, at least I think it's supposed to be Torment, get referenced in the story. Granted, this is more of this is what they're doing after the events of Darkest Faerie, which would have been about 20 years ago at the time of that plot. Hell, the site has even referenced some of the cut characters from the earlier version of the game. Funnily enough, the game wasn't always intended for the PlayStation 2. It's not entirely to say that the game was hit with development hell like some projects. As far as I can tell, it's quite the opposite. The game was originally intended for the PlayStation 1, but it wasn't like that version was meant for closer to the launch of the site or something. That being said, a funny aside I remember seeing or hearing somewhere is that the original intent for Neopets was for the site to be a place to expand on the lore of a larger game, but I haven't been able to confirm that anywhere. Mostly bringing this up because the story feels like it would explain why there would be a PlayStation version of the Darkest Faerie. However, this PlayStation 1 version was revealed back in early 2003, when the PlayStation 1 was far past its prime and the PlayStation 2 would have been out for at least 2 years. The website itself would have been around for 3 years at that point, with the game itself originally intended for release later in 2003, around what would have been the 4th anniversary of the site. Around the time the game was originally supposed to be released, there was a blog post on the site explaining that the game would be reworked for the PlayStation 2 instead, because the scope of the game had begun to rise to a point that it wasn't feasible on a console from 1994. What little we have from this version has the box art referring to the game as Part 1. If I had to guess, this version would have consisted of probably just Act 1 from the finished game, especially as that act can be pretty beefy in and of itself. But it would also imply that they had a larger story in mind that either could have been the other 3 acts of the game as separate releases, or something similar. It does sadden me because this version is just interesting to me, but we don't have a whole lot to latch onto. It wasn't even developed by the same development team. Originally, the Code Monkeys, developers of hit games like Goofy's Funhouse and Garfield 2004, were supposed to make the game. But when the game was restarted on the PlayStation 2, the PlayStation 1 version was effectively cancelled. The developers of the finished products were Idle Minds, which is a bit more notable, especially as they are at least still around, albeit by a different name. Under their original name, Idle Minds was known for games like Cold Borders 3 and 4, the HD collection of Ratchet & Clank, and, funnily enough, the PSN game Pain. That's a weird enough game in and of itself that I'm half tempted to look at it, but I've got this project to do first. They are known now under the name Deck 9, and are much more known for the Life is Strange series, which I don't have an opinion on one way or the other, and don't really have much interest in. The point is, they have a larger pedigree, so it makes sense why they would be considered to make the game. There were many cuts between the PlayStation 1 and PS2 version of Darkest Faerie, such as the game at one point being planned to have 3 playable protagonists, whereas the final game only has 2. In fact, not only was one character cut, but of the 2 characters that did make it to the game, one of them was changed. In the E3 press release for the game, Tormund apparently was set in stone. An Aisha character was allegedly turned into Roberta, who is an Akara, not an Aisha, though they do look similar. And if I'm mispronouncing the names of these species, to be fair, some of these names are kind of hard. And then you have something like Loop, which is fairly easy. The third character was Grimlix, who, interestingly enough, was an important character on the site during multiple plots over the years. Sally, the Aisha character, has been referenced after she was cut, albeit only in the Neopets trading card game from the 2000s. I do feel like her design could have been reused as one of the side characters in Act 1 while Tormund is still on his family's farm, but I'm not 100% sure. She probably got the worst of the 3 characters from the PS1 version, considering she's not even referenced. Though, funnily enough, the only footage of the PlayStation 1 version that we have is Sally showing off one of her idle animations, so there is that at least. Other than that, the only thing we have of this first version of the game is some promo and concept art. I would like to see the prototype of this game found, but even the devs of this version believe all the assets were either lost or destroyed. Though, miracles have happened before. I mean, I doubt anyone ever expected the Nintendo 64 version of Dinosaur Plant to be found, and while the game is still inaccessible to the larger public, Rare's Project Dream and 12 Tales Conquer 64 are still known to exist, albeit owned by the original creators of those games.